Tonight we are honored to have speak to us Professor Emeritus Jacques Kornberg. After his service with the U.S. Army Medical Corps Historical Unit, he obtained his doctorate of history of Harvard, and he's taught at Stanford University and has taught for quite a while at the University of Toronto. There he's in the history department, but he also served as the director of the Jewish Studies program at the University of Toronto. Dr. Kornberg is the author of many important books on European intellectual history, a history of anti-Semitism in Europe, and history of European Jewry. His book on Theodor Herzl, From Assimilation to Zionism, is a very important study of Herzl's life and psychology, and it was given honors in the U.S. National Jewish Book Award in 1994. He's the author of many other articles. He edited and contributed to the collection At the Crossroads, Essays on Ahad Hayam. It was published by SUNY Press in 1983. He's written on the Jews of Vienna, on Holocaust studies. Most recently, he's been working on Catholic-Jewish relations, and that's what we'll speak about tonight. He's engaged in a book-length study about the controversies over Pius XII and his involvement, or lack of involvement in the Holocaust of the European Jewry. And we're happy and honored to have him tonight, so please welcome Professor Jacques.
I want to thank Professor Paul Cooperman and all those working with him for inviting me to contribute to this important, apparently 25-year-old event devoted to a better understanding of the Holocaust, or otherwise known as the Shoah, which means in Hebrew catastrophe. And it's an event that deals with other genocides and mass atrocities as well. And I must say I've received a gracious reception here at this university. And by a happy coincidence, I have an old friend, who, Professor Richard Weinman, who has taught here as long as I've taught at the University of Toronto. And it's wonderful being connected again with him after all these years. This lecture is called Papal Responses to Wartime Atrocities and Genocide, a Comparative View. And what I'm going to do is compare the record of Pope Pius XII during World War II with the record of Benedict XV, who was Pope during World War I, and Pius XI, who was Pope in the 1920s and 30s, up to 39, during the period of the rise of fascism in Europe. And of course, Pope Pius XII, he has his defenders and he also has many detractors, and he's been condemned for his public impartiality as between the Allies and the Axis during World War II. You know, the era of the destruction of European Jewry and other mass atrocities. And I'm using the word impartiality deliberately. That's the word that they used, both Benedict XV in World War I, Pius XII in World War II. He was not silent. It's wrong to say he was silent. He condemned war in general, atrocities in general, the deaths of innocents on all sides, but he was impartial in that he did not condemn and point out the perpetrators of atrocities. And so he's been criticized and condemned. But, few people think of Benedict XV during World War I these days, and no one condemns him, and his response to the Armenian genocide in World War I, the genocide of 1915. Or take Pope Pius XI, who was Pope in the 20s and 30s, his response to the use of mustard gas in terror bombings against civilians during the Italian conquest of Ethiopia in 1935 and 1936. So there are those who say, and someone no less than Cardinal Domenico Cardini, who was Undersecretary of State in the Vatican during the reign of Pope Pius XII, he said that Pius XII, with his cautious temperament and his training as a diplomat, was particularly ill-suited to handle the crisis of his times, the rise of fascism, terror, war, atrocities, genocide. And one historian, actually a Canadian historian, calls the Pope, Pope Pius XII, at heart an appeaser. And some insist that Benedict XV, or Pius XI, in contrast to Pius XII, would not have been impartial and would have shown far more backbone. And we know that Pius XI, for example, was very passionate by temperament, forceful and outspoken in ways that Pius XII was not. So my argument is that all three popes acted similarly in the face of genocide and mass atrocities, and there was no difference between the way Pope Pius XII handled it and earlier popes handled it. And then I want to conclude with an explanation of what this tells us about the papacy. So if you look at Benedict XV, who was Pope from 1914, just before the outbreak of World War I, till 1922, he faced systematic atrocities and genocide of the Armenians by the Ottoman government, otherwise known as the Turkish Empire, still then called the Ottoman Empire. And let me give you two examples about Benedict XV. Basically, he followed a policy of political impartiality. Not silence, but impartiality. And there was to be no public condemnation or pressure against those committing mass atrocities. And first example is the German invasion and occupation of Belgium in 1914, at the beginning of the war. And in the early months of the war, around 5,000 Belgian civilians were killed, innocent civilians, in reprisal for some Belgian sniper attacks against German forces. But these were innocent civilians, and it was reprisal. And also, Germans tended to be Lutheran, and many were anti-Catholic, and there was a good deal of Catholic churches being burnt down. And the famous library at the University of Louvain, which is a very famous Catholic university, was destroyed. Others, and priests were accused of espionage and shot. So the Pope met these events with impartiality. And many Belgian Catholics felt that the Pope had betrayed his duty to defend Catholic rights and has abdicated his role as moral exemplar. And the Vatican nuncio, or the ambassador from the Vatican to Belgium, strongly advised him to issue a declaration in support of the Belgians. And this would also strengthen the Catholic political parties in Belgium at the end of the war. And so finally the Pope said something in this was the annual allocution, the formal speech to the Consistory of Cardinals, which is a formal gathering of cardinals, and this happened 22 January 1915. And I'm quoting his words now, and you see the way he thought about his position. He began by emphasizing that as, quote, the vicar of Christ, which he was, meaning the representative of Christ, who died for all and each, and as the common father of Catholics, popes refer to themselves as the common father, who has sons on all belligerent sides, and for whose salvation he has equal solicitude, he must not consider the special interests that divide Catholics, but the common bond that makes them brothers. And this exactly was a statement of moral political impartiality in the higher interests of religion. And he then spoke about the horrors of war and appealed to those who, quote, have crossed the frontiers of adversary nations, not to go beyond strict military necessity. And this was clearly an appeal to Germany, although he never mentioned Germany, but he did refer to our beloved people of Belgium. And it was an appeal, not a condemnation. And the appeal could also be read as an appeal to the Tsarist Russian government, because its armies had crossed the frontier into the Polish part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it had this general quality. And then he appealed to the occupied country, not to stir up disorder against the occupier. And he was pleading for moderation on both sides, the occupier and the occupied, asking for no resistance by the occupied and no repression by the occupier. And he went on to talk about the deeper causes of the war. Causes of the war was sin. Sin was to blame. Sin, human sin. Sin was universal. Sin was to blame means everyone was to blame and no one was to blame. It was a statement, I mean, in a way he was right, but it's clearly a statement of moral equivalence. And he concluded, the common father of Catholics must embrace all the combatants in the same sentiment of charity. Any other attitude on his part, and I'm quoting him, would create a lack of sympathy and a hatred against religion, and expose the tranquility and internal concord of the Church to grave disturbances. So again, he justified the Vatican's political impartiality in terms of the higher demands of his pastoral role as Pope. And, you know, I mean, from his point of view, condemnations of perpetrators could only split the Church. I mean, this is wartime. Catholics on both sides are fighting each other. They're all national patriots. And, I mean, the German Catholic bishops did not condemn the German army for burning churches, but condemned the Belgians for provoking them. So, you know, Catholics on both sides were national patriots. On both sides they had husbands and sons and brothers who were spilling their blood for the national cause. And Catholics on both sides would not accept criticism that weakened national morale, not even by the Pope. In a way, this shows the weakness of the Pope. The notion that the Pope was strong is not correct. I mean, he knew that at best they would ignore him, which would not be good. And at worst, they would be deeply offended, and there was a chance that the national church would weaken its ties with Rome, or even sever its ties. So, also for the Pope, the Church Universal was a communion, was a fellowship of believers, and a fellowship in Christ. And a church ripped apart by a Pope taking sides would betray the message of universal fellowship that the church was charged to bring to the world. Okay, just a little more on Belgium. In the winter of 1915-1916, Cardinal Mercier, M-E-R-C-I-E-R, who was the primate of the Belgian church, instigated a joint open letter by Belgian bishops to the bishops of Germany and Austro-Hungary, who were allies, claiming that harsh German policies in Belgium were unprovoked by Belgians. It's your fault. And the letter was a culmination of mutual accusations on both sides, the Belgian Catholic Church and the German Catholic Church. And Pope Benedict's one concern was to dampen the controversy and, again, create the facade of church unity. And he succeeded in doing that by pleading with the German bishops not to respond to the letter. And for him, Cardinal Mercier was putting his Belgian patriotism ahead of his concern for the unity of the church. And again, German Catholics prepared for war. Catholics were 1/3 of the German population in those days. They prepared for war by packing the churches. I mean, this is, the problem of the Pope dealing with nationalism. Nationalism then God yoked to the service of nationalism, because they were packing the churches, taking communion, undertaking penance and works of charity, all to beseech God for victory against the godless enemy, France, Protestant England, and Eastern Orthodox Tsarist Russia. So they saw themselves as on the national crusade. And after a year of war, this wartime, an aura kind of settles around the nation, which is now consecrated by the blood of fallen heroes, fathers, brothers, sons, loved ones who have become loved ones of sacred memory. So there was a big controversy, English bishops, Canadian bishops too, bishops from various countries talking about how the Pope was responding. And this was an English bishop who said, a Catholic bishop, the Pope's priority is the safe navigation of the bark of St. Peter, the bark meaning the boat, get it safely across, St. Peter being the church, get it safely across to the other side during the war. And he put his finger on the problem, and he said, if an angel of heaven told one side or the other in war that their beloved armies had murdered the innocent, desecrated churches, violated women and children, they would receive the message with derision. and reject the messenger as a friend of Satan. The faithful needed the church to pray for their nation's victory, not to be criticized. They were beseeching God to protect their loved ones and bring them victory. And the last thing they wanted to do was have the Pope vilify them. Now you can argue from the Belgian example that this was not, not an exceptional atrocity in wartime. But then you have the Armenian genocide of 1915. And this was also done under cover of wartime, and by the time it had spent its force, up to 1.5 million Armenians had been murdered by order of the Turkish authorities. The Armenian population of eastern Anatolia being the heartland of the Turkish people, had all but disappeared from the face of the earth. Most victims were members of the Armenian Apostolic Church, which was an Eastern Orthodox church. Around 100,000 victims were Armenian Roman Catholics, including 7 bishops, 130 priests, and 47 nuns. So this strikes close to home. And again, the Monsignor Angelo Dolci, who was the papal ambassador to Constantinople, today known as Istanbul, right, wrote to the Vatican that the Ottoman government aimed to put an end to the Armenian nation by extermination. Clear. And the Pope first responded on October 1915 with a private letter to the Sultan, Mohammed Reshad. And the private letter pleaded with him. He said, "An entire nation's fearful groans tears our souls apart." And he pleaded with the Sultan to punish anyone guilty of crimes, but not the innocent. And the wording of the private letter was not released. If you look at the New York Times in that period, they have simply reported a letter had been sent interceding for the Armenian people. And Benedict made one other public reference to Armenia, again in an allocution to the Sacred Conclave College of Cardinals in late 1915. And he spoke of the widespread ruin created by war and the unparalleled butchery of World War I, and singled out Armenia. This fateful war grows in fury and threatens unfortunate Armenia with complete and final ruin. Again, the fault was the war. And Germany, in this situation, Germany was an ally of the Ottoman Empire, was an ally of Turkey, a very close ally. There were German staff officers leading units of the Turkish army. And Germany hoped, with its alliance with the Ottoman Empire, to replace Britain in the Middle East. The German government did nothing to intervene. There were German consuls in the Ottoman Empire writing back to the Foreign Office in Berlin saying, this is happening, this is happening. But the German government was not going to weaken its ally in wartime. So, again, what Benedict did was deferring to the nationalism, to German nationalism, and in wartime. He did not encourage German Catholics to go against their government. He did not warn German Catholics about engaging in or being complicit in atrocities committed by its ally. He did not encourage German Catholics to protest their government's actions in support of the Ottoman Empire and during the destruction of the Armenians. And he did not even ask German Catholics to pray for the Armenians. He did not make clear to German Catholics that silence in the face of mass crimes was equivalent to complicity. And it was not only wrong to commit crimes, but to stand by while others committed crimes. So again, you see the spiritual priority to maintain his spiritual and moral authority over Catholics as their Pope. He had to abdicate his moral authority in wartime. And you can see, I'm trying to see, the world through the eyes of the papacy and what their priorities were. So there's another reason why Benedict XV did not speak out strongly. He didn't want to drive a wedge between the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire was, was part of the whole, European treaties with the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire had allowed Catholic missions to establish schools and hospitals and churches in the Middle East and in Turkey. And now Turkey, so there's Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Turkey on one side, there's Britain, France, Tsarist Russia, later the US on the other side in this war. So for the Pope, the big danger was, and what happened was, the Ottoman Empire allowed the Church, missionaries, priests, etc., convents, to protect the Christian holy places. So they were accessible to Christian pilgrimage and protected by members of the Church. This is holy places, pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land, the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, the Church of Annunciation, the Church of St. Peter, and so on. And with France and Italy at war with the Ottoman government, the Turks kicked out Italian and French priests from the empire. And they renounced their treaties giving special protection to Europeans. But the danger came from the fact that Tsarist Russia was in war, with the Ottoman Empire. And the worst case for the Pope was a Russian victory that would take Russia to Constantinople, which was once the capital, Constantine, of the Church, of the Eastern Orthodox Church. It was, as it were, a second Rome during the period of the Byzantine Empire, the successor to the Roman Empire. And the British had guaranteed to the Russians, their allies, that if Turkey was defeated, the ancient Santa Sophia Church in Constantinople, which was the Catholic shrine, actually had been turned into a mosque during the period of Ottoman domination, but it had, like St. Peter's in Rome, it had these associations with Catholics. But the British-Russian agreement was that the Russians, if they defeated Turkey, would take Constantinople and occupy Santa Sophia, rededicate it as a rival to Rome, and that there would be, like the Vatican, an extraterritorial area around the church where the Holy Synod, or Synod, which is the governing group of the Russian Orthodox Church, would sit, just like the cardinals are sitting in Rome. So the big threat for Pius was a victory by Russia, and the last thing he wanted to do, holy sites. Most religions have holy sites, right? And the last thing he wanted was a Russian victory in that area, with the Eastern Orthodox Church perched on the borders of Europe, next to Romania and so on and so forth. So we're back to the Armenian genocide. The Pope did not want to weaken the Ottoman Empire. And by condemning the genocide of the Armenians, including Catholic Armenians. So, how does one see this? I'll tell you how I see it. There are other the preservation of Christian holy places and pilgrimage sites, as well as preventing a rival religion, Eastern Orthodoxy, from spreading at the expense of Catholicism, took precedence over speaking out and modeling righteous behavior for Catholics, in this instance, in the face of genocide. Well, I guess the Pope and I have a different understanding of righteous behavior. So, holy sites are very bad because, there are many examples today. And trouble with holy sites is they become unholy because people are willing to kill and die to maintain them. So now let's move on to, I'll give you one example from the story of Pope Pius XI at the time of the the Italian conquest of Ethiopia in 1935-36. The Italians always wanted an empire, an African empire, an East African empire. And, they had conquered Libya in the 19th century, and they had failed to conquer Ethiopia in the 1890s, suffered humiliation. That was under the previous government. But now we're in the time of Mussolini and fascist, highly nationalistic Italy. And in the summer of 1935, Mussolini was openly threatening to invade Ethiopia unless the Ethiopians conceded a good part of the country to him. And Pope Pius XI, we know, privately opposed the invasion. And, again, what was his concern? Under the Ethiopian government, Catholic missionaries were free to proselytize and to create churches and schools in Ethiopia. And the fear was that the invasion by Italy would poison relationships between the Catholic Church and the Ethiopian government. And already you see there were people talking about missionaries who were trying to foster a native, missionaries then were trying to foster, this was under Pope Pius XI, there was a huge attempt to create churches in non-European countries and to appoint bishops, native bishops in Ethiopia, etc., to expand the universality of the Catholic Church. And all of a sudden, talk of the invasion, the Ethiopians are talking about these missionaries are spies, and you got to beware of the Europeans, etc. And now, what's Pope Pius thinking of? Number one, he's thinking the Roman Church has a very good relationship with Mussolini. And they did. I mean, much better than the Catholic Church in Germany did under Hitler. Much better. And the Roman Church had a stake in the status quo in Italy. Because there was the 1929 Lateran Accords, in which Mussolini had agreed to establish Vatican City as a sovereign state. It was, it's a little part of Rome. I forgot how many acres. But it became, by treaty, a sovereign state under the sovereignty of the Pope, which meant for the Pope that he was independent of the Italian government, and that he was a Pope for all the people. And it also, there was an accompanying treaty between the Church and the state, the Italian state, which recognized Catholicism as the state religion, which hadn't occurred under the anti-clerical governments before Mussolini. So now it becomes a state religion. Religion is taught in the schools, and Catholic religious marriages are recognized as equivalent to civil marriages, and all those. And then the Pope is thinking about the outcome of this war. If there's war, if he invades Ethiopia, who knows what will happen? One danger was that he'd be isolated from Britain and France, and in isolation, go closer to Hitler as an ally. And Hitler was anti-Catholic, pagan, deeply ideological in his anti-religious attitude. So he did not want an invasion that might isolate Italy and strengthen the bond between Italy and Germany. So, Italy could become more fascist, more pagan, more anti-clerical, and all that. An invasion was a danger. If the war was lost, if the invasion turned out to be a fiasco, Mussolini might be overthrown. And the Church might lose its privileges in Italy, or Italy might be open to a communist coup, or whatever. So the invasion was a bad idea. And he spoke out against it in August 35. And what he said is it was pointed, but he talked about war and its ravages. War is bad. It creates horror and this kind of thing. But he didn't say a word about the rights and wrongs of the fact of Italy invading and occupying a fellow member of the League of Nations at that time, Ethiopia. And he stressed the need for compromise to avoid war. And he hoped that Ethiopia would concede something and Italy would, through negotiations, negotiate a compromise. I don't know whether he knew or didn't know that Mussolini was not interested in negotiation, but wanted war to toughen up the Italians. And so the Italian newspapers considered that speech, where he talked about the need for compromise to avoid war, the Italian government considered it an attack on its policies and banned copies of the Vatican newspaper, the official Vatican newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, which actually was widely read in Italy because it was the only paper not controlled by the Italian government. But the Italian government banned copies of it. So Pius is looking to see what's happening. And he backtracks in September and appeals again for a peaceful resolution of a conflict. However, this time he praises the Italian people and expresses regard for their national aspirations. And then Italy invades Ethiopia in October 1935. And Mussolini had ordered a systematic policy of terror against civilians. Simply terror, to scare the pants off them. And this involved the use of mustard bombs, mustard gas. And perhaps 250,000 of Ethiopian civilians, including Ethiopian soldiers, died or were injured by mustard gas attacks from the air. And mustard gas leads to a slow and agonizing death. It burns the skin, and the death is prolonged. So the Pope gets a call from Cardinal Arthur Hinsley, who is of Britain, who is the primate of the British Catholic Church. And Hinsley says, pleads with him to disassociate himself from Italy's aggression. And this is what's going on. I mean, British Catholics are furious at Italy for doing this, because, it also means, in itself, it's a violation of the League of Nations. It's going to break what ended up to be a fragile pact of security created by the Covenant of the League of Nations, which specified that no member state can invade another member state, and all member states have to intervene if, and that started collapsing with Ethiopia. Anyway, so Hinsley tells them this, and because British Catholics were very strongly opposed to this. But what's going on? What about the Italian Catholics? Well, clergy and bishops are supporting the war. They're not listening to the Pope. And not only are they supporting the war, but they're placing the church in war service. They're melting church bells for metal and offering hymns of thanksgiving, collecting gold and silver for the war effort. And Pius XI had to face the fact that he had no hold on Italian Catholics in political matters. And, political matters means that area where morals and politics, overlap. And so the Italian army captured Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, on May 4th, 1936, and soon after announced the war was over. It wasn't quite over, but they announced it was over. And now, so Italian victory, and the Italian people are overjoyed, and now the Pope is not criticizing. And on 12th May, that's a week after the Italian army captured the capital of Ethiopia, the Pope speaks glowingly to Italians of the triumphal joy of a great and good people. So he felt he had to do that, but these words are a post facto exoneration of the atrocities committed by the Italian army in Ethiopia, and of all the Italian government had to did to destroy the system, the fragile system of collective security that existed in the 30s. So, okay. So I've given you examples, 3 examples of how popes dealt with mass atrocities and genocide. And let's compare them now to Pope Pius XII during World War II. Because he also, and I find, you read speeches of his to his cardinals, I find the same phrases used as Benedict XV did during World War I. He maintained, Pope Pius XII, a public impartiality during the genocide of the European Jews, the mass murder of Polish Catholics. So, it wasn't, I'm going to be quiet only when Jews are involved. That's not going on at all. And the deportation of millions of Poles, forced labor in Germany, and the genocide by a Catholic state, Catholic Croatia, of 500,000 Serbs. Catholics who are attached to the Pope. So the issue is not that Pius XII, like his personality was such that he became a fence-sitter while other popes would have acted differently. It's not the issue. The issue is, what is it in the nature of the papacy that made all three popes behave in the same way or have similar policies? And this is the way I see it, this is my opinion. By the 20th century, now, there's a history here, and it's the history of the church in the modern period. By the 20th century, for various reasons, which I don't want to go into, it'll be too long, the Roman Catholic Church had become much more centralized than it had ever been. And, I'm not going to go into the reasons, too long. So the Pope was a kind of monarch, and the church was organized along centralized authoritarian lines. Popes, by that time, were in a position, and this was a position the Vatican fought for, to appoint all bishops in all countries, which was very different from, say, the first half of the 19th century and before, where monarchs played a strong role in appointing bishops. So the Pope saw himself, and I don't know if you know some history of the Catholic Church, Vatican I in 1870, Vatican Council I proclaimed the infallibility of the Pope when pronouncing on matters of dogma, which, putting that in writing as an absolute did a lot to, popes didn't use it much, but did a lot to increase the prestige of the papacy and authority of the papacy in the church. And the ideology was that Catholics had to defer to the teaching authority of the Pope, even when he talked about, not only dogma, but day-to-day matters. And so the Pope is in this position now of heading a highly centralized church. And what he had to ensure, and then, you have a church that's, it's a transnational church, right? It's not the British Anglican Church. It's a church in Italy, Germany, France, Belgium, and other countries. And he's got to hold it together because, the main thing is to ensure the doctrinal and disciplinary authority of the church, of the Pope, who was the common father. And the Pope was now in a position that he was holding the faith together and trying to impose unity on a church which was riven by, nationalistic interests, in all countries, etc. He was the common father. And this is what Pope Pius XII said in 1944. The Pope must maintain the absolute trust of all Catholics on all sides, to the common Father. And thus the Pope must show himself independent and impartial. And in addition, in the church, the way the Pope saw it, who had a quite authoritarian view of the church, he felt he had a paternal responsibility for the spiritual well-being of the faithful and for keeping them on the path to salvation. He felt it as a personal responsibility. And that meant, and he said, the responsibility of the Pope is to the sinners and the weak. Not those Catholics who are good Catholics, but the sinners and the weak. He had to keep them under the umbrella of the church. And he had to keep Catholics, this is the way he saw it, within the circle of grace and salvation. And, like Pope Pius XI, there's a line here, a straight line said, excessive severity would only harden the hearts of those who live under our pastoral responsibility. No excessive severity, because it'll push Catholics away from the church. And, he's facing, this is a world of, communism, socialism, anti-clericalism, liberalism, fascism, threatening ideologies that people are going for. So one has to tread softly, not to turn Catholics away from the church. And the way I see it, that it means that no matter what sins or atrocities Catholics had committed or were complicit in, the church was always there to offer the possibility of salvation and penance. And as Pope Pius XII said in 1943, what severs a man from the body of the church is not sin, not committing atrocities. The only thing that severs a man from the body of the church is heresy, schism, and apostasy. So I'm thinking that the church's role, as the Pope saw it, was not to confront radical evil, but to help save sinners after the fact. Therefore, and this is my last word, my conclusion. Therefore, the priorities of a revealed religion, and I see this also as a weakness in other religions, institutional religions that claim to have the whole truth. The priorities of a revealed religion carrying precious objective truth, offering the hope of salvation, and seeking to preserve the institutional structure that made this all necessary and possible, trumped political morality. And popes responded weakly to monstrous violations of divine and human law, which means that justice as a value was sacrificed to salvation as a value. Finished.